Have you ever wondered what sparked the prolonged and devastating Iran-Iraq War? How did two neighboring nations end up in a conflict that lasted nearly a decade? To understand, we need to delve into a complex web of underlying tensions and disputes. The seeds of conflict were sown in border disagreements, territorial claims, political rivalries, and deep-seated religious differences. At the heart of this was the leadership of both nations, particularly the role of Iraq's Saddam Hussein. Hussein, a figure of immense controversy and ambition, was keen to assert Iraq's power and influence in the region. He was also deeply wary of the Islamic Revolution that had taken place in Iran only a year earlier, fearing its potential to inspire similar upheavals in Iraq. These simmering tensions and disputes were not new. However, under Hussein's leadership, they took a turn towards the catastrophic. So, with tensions escalated, Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, launched a surprise invasion of Iran on September 22, 1980. The Iran-Iraq War was not a conflict defined by strategic precision, but rather, a war marked by sheer brutality and indiscriminate violence. From the outset, the war was a chilling demonstration of the depths to which human cruelty can sink. The battlefield was a theater of horrors, where rules of engagement were often ignored and the lines between combatants and non-combatants blurred. This was a war where chemical weapons were not just threats, but a terrifying reality. Iraq, under the iron-fisted rule of Saddam Hussein, unleashed a deadly cocktail of mustard gas and nerve agents on Iranian soldiers and civilians alike. The harrowing images of the victims, men, women, and children gasping for air, their bodies convulsed in pain, are a stark reminder of the war's unflinching cruelty. Civilians weren't simply caught in the crossfire, they were deliberately targeted. Residential areas were bombed, causing untold destruction and carnage. The war was not confined to the battlefield, it seeped into homes, schools, and marketplaces, robbing millions of their peace and security. The war was also economically devastating. Both nations targeted each other's oil installations, crippling their economies and leaving them in financial ruin. The oil fires that raged during the war were a grim testament to the economic devastation, their dark smoke blotting out the sun and casting an ominous shadow over the region. The human cost was staggering, hundreds of thousands of lives were lost, and countless more were scarred by the horrors they had witnessed. Many soldiers returned from the front lines only to face a lifetime of physical and psychological trauma. The war left a generation of orphans and widows, and countless families torn apart by loss. The war, initially tipped in Iraq's favor, quickly became a grueling and costly affair for both nations. It was a war that showed the world the devastating consequences of unbridled aggression and the depths of human cruelty. It was a war that neither nation could truly win, and its scars are still visible today. Despite the early gains by Iraq, the war soon turned into a stalemate, a deadlock that neither side could break. This wasn't a quick skirmish, a flash-in-the-pan conflict that would be over before the world had time to blink. No, this was a protracted struggle, a grueling test of endurance for both nations involved. As time wore on, the initial momentum that Iraq had enjoyed began to wane. Their surprise invasion had made an impact, yes, but it hadn't been enough to secure a swift and decisive victory. Instead, the war devolved into a drawn-out battle of attrition, with neither side able to land that knockout blow. In the trenches on the front lines, Iranian and Iraqi soldiers found themselves locked in an unending cycle of attack and counterattack. Every inch of ground gained was hard-fought, every strategic advantage was temporary at best. This wasn't a war of grand strategies or brilliant maneuvers, it was a war of attrition, a war of endurance, a war where the only certainty was uncertainty. The human cost was staggering. Both sides suffered heavy losses not only in terms of soldiers but also in the devastating impact on the civilian population. Homes were destroyed, families torn apart, entire communities left in ruins. The toll on the psyche of both nations was immense, the scars of this conflict etched deep into the collective memory. But it wasn't just the human cost that was alarming. The economic damage was equally significant. Infrastructure was razed, oil installations targeted, and economies strained to their breaking points. Both Iran and Iraq were left reeling, their resources stretched thin, their futures uncertain. And throughout all this, the world watched, waited, and wondered when the end would come. But the end was nowhere in sight. The war, far from reaching a clear conclusion, seemed to stretch on with no end in sight. In 1988, the Iran-Iraq War finally ended, not with a decisive victory, but with a United Nations brokered ceasefire. This marked the end of an 8-year-long conflict that had tested the resilience of both nations and had left a deep impact not just on them but on the entire world. The immediate aftermath of the war was characterized by a profound sense of loss and devastation. Both Iran and Iraq had suffered greatly in terms of human lives and economic resources. The war had cost hundreds of thousands of lives, and the economic damage ran into billions of dollars. The infrastructure of both nations was in ruins, and their societies were deeply scarred by the horrors of the war. But the end of the conflict also marked the beginning of a new era for both nations. In the face of adversity, they had developed more advanced military capabilities. The war had forced them to innovate and adapt, and as a result, they emerged from the conflict with stronger and more technologically advanced armed forces. However, the war also left a legacy of continued regional instability. The conflict had exacerbated existing tensions and created new ones. The power vacuum created by the war led to a rise in sectarian violence and the emergence of extremist groups. The borders that had been disputed before the war remained contentious, and the political rivalries that had fueled the conflict continued to simmer. The end of the war did not mean the end of suffering for the people of Iran and Iraq. The wounds of the war took a long time to heal, and the scars remain visible even today.